It's a pleasure to welcome you here today as part of Global Climate Change Week at the University of Wollongong. Today, our session will focus on extreme weather events. While we wait for people to join us today, you might like to put in the chat where you're joining us from. I believe we've got people from various parts of the world, and I would like you to acknowledge the countries that you're from in Australia and the countries you're from across the globe. So we've got people from Wagga, Campbelltown, Darwell country, beautiful, Wambara. Yes, greetings from beautiful Wadi Wadi country. Tamworth, welcome Tamworth. Welcome from Wongal country. Right, before we begin today, I was speaking to Josie Atkinson, a Kumbangir woman. She's an artist from the Central North Coast and also a student of UOW. And she has been very kind to share with us some of her artwork. And the background that I've got today is Josie's work, and it's titled Heal Country, Heal Climate. And we'll play a short video acknowledgement that Josie has prepared and given us permission to use.
I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we're all zooming in from today and pay my respects on behalf of everyone here to the ancestors and elders, past, present and future. And thanks Beer Apply for this feed of pippies.
I thought everybody would want to see the pippies that Josie was talking about. And I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm sitting at the moment. I'm sitting in Darwell lands, the lands of the Wadi Wadi people. And I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and particularly those Aboriginal emerging elders that have chosen UOW to be part of their lifelong journey. And thank you very much, everybody, for telling me where you're coming from. And I know that you will acknowledge the traditional owners of your location. Speaking to Josie earlier in the week, she said that many people are uncomfortable about having acknowledgement of country broadcast over the internet because people are in so many different countries. So if you find this a difficult concept, just bear with us, and we acknowledge that this isn't the best way to acknowledge country for everybody. And I'll also just refer to that beautiful artwork that we have, the tree, and note that the university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonization on our campus footprint. And we commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing, and education. My name is Tim McCarthy. I'm Professor of Sustainable Design, and I'm the Director of the Sustainable Buildings Research Centre on the beautiful Innovation Campus at Wollongong. I welcome the attendees who are here today. We've got a great panel. We've got Robert Oge, we've got Andrew McCulloch and Joshua McLaren, who are going to do a double act, Vanessa Organo and Dr. George Takacs. Robert Oge is a UOW Pearl Fellow specializing in critical infrastructure and disaster modeling. Dr. Oge has also been recognized for his innovative work, which saw him closely and with the SES, working closely with the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, the so-called CALD communities, during natural disasters. Andrew McCulloch and Joshua McLaren are both disaster professionals and strategists and thought leaders. Andrew and Josh are UOW alumni, and together they founded Beyond Disaster, a social enterprise. They host Australia's leading disaster management podcast, Me, Myself and Disaster. They have also founded Australian Young Professionals in Disaster. Vanessa Organo is an international development professional with a background in climate change, disaster management and environmental management. Vanessa works for the International Organization for Migration, IOM, supporting programs in climate change and disaster-related displacement. Dr. George Takacs is an honorary senior fellow with the School of Physics at the UOW. George is one of the founders of Global Climate Change Week initiative. So thank you, George, for setting this up so many years ago. George's research has focused on climate action, including both mitigation and adaptation. The panel will now discuss a series of questions with me, and we encourage members of the audience to submit their own questions in the Q&A function And we'll be turning off the chat function at this point. So welcome, panelists. George, I've got a question for you.
Far away, Tim.
Okay, to start with, can you explain to our audience what classifies an extreme weather event and what trends are we seeing globally?
Yes, okay. So with the classification, it's somewhat arbitrary, but it's basically an event which has a low probability of occurring at a particular place at a particular time of year. So the arbitrariness becomes, what do you believe low probability be? Is it less than 10% chance of occurring, less than 5%, less than 1 in 1,000? But whichever threshold you choose, you can then go and have a look and see, well, what's happening with trends in events, those sort of extreme events. So the trends we're seeing, it's really, to really understand the trends, you really need to look globally, because you can get quite a lot of variation in a small geographic area. So if we look at heat, and you look at daily maximum temperatures, what we're finding is that temperatures that are above the 99.9 percentile, so 1 in 1,000, what was a 1 in 1,000 one is now occurring about 1 in 200, right? So the probability at a particular temperature threshold has increased by a factor of 5. If we look at heat waves, and a heat wave is generally defined as 3 or more successive days where both maximum and minimum temperatures are higher than you would expect. A 1 in 50 heat wave, what was a 1 in 50 heat wave is now about a 1 in 10 chance of occurring. What was a 1 in 10 heat wave is now about 1 in 3. So we're seeing quite significant increases there in heat. And that's probably the most pronounced change we're seeing in extremes. We are seeing some changes in rainfall. So if we look at daily rainfall, rainfall events at the 99.9 percentile have increased by about 18%. So not as big an increase as we've seen with temperature, but still significant. Heavy rainfall is becoming more frequent and intense across most of the world, and with the exception of Mediterranean-style climates. Mediterranean-style climates, obviously the Mediterranean, but also, say, southwest Western Australia. With drought, we're really only seeing an increase in drought at this stage because of an increase in temperatures, which has led to an increase in evaporation in the soils. There's very few places where there's any statistically significant change in drought other than due to change in the evaporation. And then with cyclones, if we look at cyclones, we're not seeing globally a change in the frequency of cyclones, but we are seeing an increase in cyclones, the most severe cyclones, so category 4 and 5 cyclones have increased in frequency. And at the same time, we're seeing with a lot of those cyclones is they are tracking more slowly across the landscape, and that exacerbates the impacts that they have because more rainfall occurs over an area because as a cyclone tracks more slowly and there's more chance for wind damage to occur as well. So they're the sort of trends we're seeing globally, Tim.
Wow, it's a frightening picture in a way, and it's one that we've all experienced ourselves. We've seen so much wet in New South Wales over the last year. And I was in Ireland during July, and Ireland experienced its hottest day on record, 33.5 degrees. Now, Australians might think that's not much, but in a country that does not know air conditioning and driving a car with inadequate air conditioning, that felt very, very hot indeed. And it's interesting to hear those statistics, George, that what was a really once in a lifetime event is now happening once a generation. And the things that were generational are happening pretty much all the time. I'd like to throw a question now to Andrew and Joshua. Josh, on your podcast, Me, Myself, and Disaster, you get the opportunity to interview some amazing people, and I'm interviewing amazing people today, and they're working in the disaster space. In your experience, just how significant are the effects of climate change on extreme weather events?
Yeah, Tim, I think it's a really good question. It's a big question to unpack in such a short amount of time, but I'll do my best. I think one thing I want to leave people with here today, and we had Craig Fugate. He was, as some of you may know, he was the head of FEMA, the American Agency for Disasters, and he was, the head advisor to President Obama. When we had him on the podcast, he really stressed to Andrew and I that, the key is to remember, we often talk about, climate change and the impacts on that on disaster. We often think about that through a lens of future. But I think for Craig, and something he's been talking a lot about, it's about that the change is actually here. The effects that we see, we're experiencing them now. And I think that's really big for us, because I think it's totally shifting the conversation around how we look at some of these things, because a lot of the time we think about the future and what do we need to be doing now for those challenges, but really we actually need to shift our mindset and our thinking to, it's a here and now problem. And I think as well, Robert Glasser, as again, people may know, we had on the podcast, talking about, when you talk about in the context of climate change and this discussion, that 1.5 degree rise, we've essentially locked that in now. And again, we need to look at it in the here and now. That 1.5 has been locked in. The consequences because of that 1.5 degree rise, it's not a matter of or a conversation around how we prevent that now. It's really a conversation around how do we actually deal with this and how do we adapt to it. So I think there's probably some things to just think about when we talk about the impact of climate change on extreme weather events. And, a recent example that, some work's been doing in this space is within the Pakistan floods. Again, many may be aware and watching the news of what's been happening in Pakistan. We had Dr. Aisha Siddiqui from the University of Cambridge on, who's been doing a lot of research in that space. And there is some research currently going on now looking at, how can we actually link disasters with that anthropogenic climate change. Where are those? Let's look at what are those concrete links between the two, and how much are climate change actually exacerbating the problem that we see on the ground. And I think that just lastly, it's in terms of how significant, for us as an industry, if you look at it from a disaster industry perspective, it's a game changer. At the moment where, if you look at the infrastructure, the systems, the resource, the strategies that the industry uses, a lot of those were designed 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago for a world that, does not even think about the consequences that we're facing now. So it's really been, I guess, a real eye-opening moment for the industry, because, the whole industry in itself is having to redefine itself and how we operate in and with disasters. And, again, I'll kind of stop here because I know this will be the discussion we have today, really challenging ourselves around what actually disasters are, what are disasters? They're not natural. They are really a consequence of the decisions that we make as individuals, governments, and communities. So I might leave it there because I know we're going to talk a bit more, Tim, but, from my perspective and the podcast, that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Oh, thank you, Josh. And I hadn't thought of it before as a disaster industry, but that's exactly what we have. And we have people like yourselves who are professionals in that space. Andrew, the work that you and Josh do in disaster management is varied and really significant. You've been on the ground during the 3 Lismore floods. Can you tell us about the work that you do and what you're seeing, experiencing firsthand with the increased number of extreme weather events? And what's the effect of that on the local communities?
Yeah, and I guess either lucky or unlucky, I've managed to be on the ground for 3 of those Lismore events, and that was in 2017 and most recently 2 this year. And it really is like, it's quite hard to describe, because you kind of go into Lismore where the event happens and it's just it's like a bomb's hit the place. Everything's just eerily quiet. There's large amounts of rubbish outside houses. And then sort of each afternoon you head back to the hotel, and in Byron Bay, just half an hour up the road, everyone's out having dinner. It's like a normal sort of place. So it's quite weird to sort of think that people so close, some are so disaster hit and some are so living their lives as normal. And I guess that's what we're sort of experiencing now. I was over in Geraldton earlier this year as well. I think it was last year for the cyclone. And that's why I started to think that things are certainly changing. We're seeing a cyclone hit as far down as Geraldton and cause such damage, because houses there are not designed to be built for cyclones. It's a disaster because we decided to build in that location and we didn't build houses that were set up to the standard that is required for the future and to be prepared for that future risk. So I think my view, I guess, of seeing these disaster zones is one of almost a FIFO worker. I fly in, I fly out. and you see how vulnerable the community is. But for them, it's, I take a very clinical view, but for them, it's a far more life-changing experience. Most of my work's really around providing early warnings, running community meetings, engaging with communities, and then I work in my role in the New South Wales government, building out volunteer numbers for future sort of disasters and building capability. And we often hear in that is people sort of say, oh, I never expected this, or this is the worst sort of flood I've seen in my life. But we're seeing that everywhere. And that's because I think disasters are certainly getting worse and the consequences are getting worse for people. So while the flood might be the same height or the same depth or the same speed, it's causing a greater influence on people's lives. And people are building those, I guess, those more vulnerable locations. So the impact is bigger. We're also seeing that increasing reliance for help. So people are becoming sort of dependent on that help, and people are becoming more and more vulnerable with the compounding and cascading disasters. So we're in this kind of constant disaster cycle now where we sort of don't know how to sort of end this. But as I said before, and as Josh alluded to, there are the only disasters because we've chosen to live in these locations and by whatever means we're there, we have to sort of work out something now to sort of combat this and combat that future risk. So I think we're going to see more of this in the future. And we're seeing Sydney, the recent floods we've had in Sydney, something like 6 major floods now, each is getting slightly larger. And we're just below the sort of main trigger points for those big evacuations in places like McGrath's Hill. So the future is a little scary, but we are seeing the consequences on those communities starting to ramp up and people becoming more and more dependent, people more and more impacted by these compounding and cascading repeated disasters that just keep happening.
Wow, and that was 3 times you've been to Lismore, and 3 times it's been inundated. And I think that also echoes what Joshua was saying about our need to adapt because this is here and it's not going away. And I think I agree with you, Andrew, that the future is scary, and we need to adopt new approaches to where we rebuild and how we rebuild back better. I'm going to throw a question now to you, Vanessa. Vanessa, you live in Vanuatu, which is a place I have on my bucket list. I need to visit at some stage. And Vanuatu is rated the country at most risk from natural disasters by the United Nations. Can you talk us through some of the extreme weather events that Vanuatu is experiencing and what this means for a country that has the front row seats at the effects of climate change?
Yes, thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me on the panel. So I thought I'd give a bit of context about Vanuatu first because people might not be aware. It's a small island developing state in the Southwest Pacific. You should come over, Tim. Make sure you tick it off your bucket list. It's only 3 hours from Sydney flight, but it's not that well known to some Australians. It's quite a scattered archipelago of islands. There's around 120 islands in the country. 83 of them are inhabited, and it's very geographically diverse. There's some islands that are larger with mountain chains, up to 2 kilometres above sea level. There's other islands that are inhabited that are small atolls where the highest point above sea level might be 4 or 5 metres only. So when we're talking about climate change and disasters in Vanuatu, the impacts can be very varied depending on the geographic nature of the island and how populated it is. Speaking to what George said before about cyclones, that is one particular extreme event that Vanuatu is very familiar with. What George mentioned about the trends of cyclones, that they are projected, the number is projected to decrease, but the intensity is expected to increase. That is a reality that Vanuatu has gone through. We've actually had 2 Category 5 cyclones in the space of 5 years, which is before unprecedented. First of all, there was Category 5 Tropical Cyclone Pam in 2015. At the time, it was the most intense cyclone that the Pacific has recorded, but since then it's been capped, which is also quite scary. it went through the central and southern parts of the islands, and it tracked very slowly. It was building up for many weeks beforehand, and then, you know, you could prepare as well as you could, but then it just tracked very slowly through the island, so the destruction was very severe. And then again in 2020, just after the borders closed, actually, due to the pandemic, Tropical Cyclone Harold struck the northern and central parts of Vanuatu, and again, very slow tracking over from a west to east direction, and it caused destruction to some more remote parts of Vanuatu, as well as the second largest town. So yeah, it's those extreme events. Cyclones are the most well known that Vanuatu is known for, but actually there's more climate change impacts happening in extreme events. There's some slower onset events that Vanuatu is now facing, especially sea level rise, ocean acidification, marine heat waves is something that Vanuatu is facing. And yeah, the impacts are pretty severe for most of Vanuatu, who is rural based. 75% of the country is based in rural or remote areas.
Well, thank you for that, Vanessa. And look, our heart goes out to communities when they are impacted by things like Harold and the floods in Lismore. And I don't know, from where I'm sitting, I feel helpless at times on this. And as we see the impact of sea level rising as well, you know, it angers me in a way. But I'm going to move on to Robert. Robert, you're a Pearl Fellow, and for those who aren't aware, Pearl is the program for emerging leaders in research at the University of Wollongong. It's a very competitive fellowship, so congratulations on being one of our Pearl Fellows. One of the issues that we face during these extreme weather events is how we can mobilize support and assistance for those affected. And you've done a lot of work with the CALD communities, the communities that are culturally and linguistically diverse. Can you tell us about that work?
Yeah, thanks very much, team. And thanks for the introduction as well. Yes, so the way I think I should mention first, when Josh and Andrew spoke, I think the way they concluded was something quite striking that I think we have to come back to, which is the idea that disasters, what we call natural disasters, are not actually natural disasters. So we have natural hazards, but what we do, the sort of actions we take is what determines whether those natural hazards will eventually culminate in disasters. So what that tells me, it's that disaster risk reduction and the actions we take as community, as government, it's quite important to ensure that we don't have situations where natural disasters are leading to natural hazards are leading to disasters. So my work really focuses on how can we better use information technology to support vulnerable people in times of natural hazards. Yeah. So one of the work research that I've done, it's called EMACORD, and I should thank Josh, who is here with us today. While he was still in the SES, he provided a lot of support for those projects. So EMACORD basically was focused on how can we make emergency messages more accessible, more understandable to people who are not, who don't have English as their first language. So we're talking here about migrants, people who, as according to what the way Tim mentioned there, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, so-called communities. So that project, we worked with the Multicultural Community Council of Illawarra. The SES was also involved in that project, thanks to Josh and his team. I was really focused on community engagement. So we also, the project also involved 7 different language groups in the Illawarra region. So Spanish, Italian, Macedonian, Mandarin, about 7 different language groups. And what we're looking at is what the messages that are being put out from the SES, how well do these messages, how well are they understood by people from these language groups? So because I remember from several discussions I've had with SES staff members, one of the questions that came up is, do we really have this concern that they don't understand these messages? How true is that? Yeah, so we thought we carry out this sort of community engagement project and get in touch one-on-one with the people that are really involved in this and see how well they understand this messages. So we got the messages from the SES. So we presented to them the top 5 messages that would normally go out during floods and storms. And something was quite interesting. So we had a different, it was more like a spectrum of people from different linguistic skills, people from those different groups. We brought people who had different levels of language capabilities, basically. So people who were born here meant they went to school here, so they could speak English well. But their parents also were people that were born overseas. So we wanted to hear from them how well they understood those messages. What was quite striking is the fact that a lot of the people who were born here couldn't even understand those messages properly. And I think this was also, we had SES staff there to witness the process, that the messages that are being put out to people from culturally linguistically diverse backgrounds are not getting across. Importantly, we wanted them to also look for people who have bilingual background, so meaning they can speak English and their first language, to see if they can help in the process of translating those messages from English to their first language. And what we also found is that this group, with a bit of support in terms of getting through those technical jargons that you will always find in some of those messages, that it was, we found that they could help in translating those messages, and those messages were really helpful and more understandable to people from CORD background. So what we're doing going from here, we're looking how to develop a system that can help these different communities to, translate messages from English, emergency messages from English, and warnings as well, from English to the different language groups. So at the moment, I'm working on that project, currently developing a tool that's going to rely on both artificial intelligence and also having humans in the loop as well to help check for errors in that translation, to ensure that communities, people from CORD background, are not disenfranchised during emergencies. That's just one way of helping to improve disaster risk reduction for people from CORD background.
Oh, thank you, Robert. That's such important work, because we need people to be able to react quickly, rapidly in dangerous situations. And I like your distinction between the natural hazards and the disasters. It's a bit like the thing that accidents don't happen, they're actually caused by something. And the hazard is something we can't avoid, but the disaster is certainly something we can. I'm going to move back to Andrew now, and I'll give you a short question. It's probably got a really long answer, because Joshua mentioned the need for climate adaptation. So I'm going to ask you the question, what does that look like? And how quickly do we need to act?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think something in terms of when we should have acted probably a long time ago, because if we had, the disasters we're facing today are probably have less consequence than they would have had otherwise. I think coming to that point that Josh made earlier around disasters aren't natural, and the environment doesn't cause disasters, is really our sort of impact. Alan Kelman, someone who spoke on the podcast, who's a professor of disasters at the University of College in London, he said we need a stronger umbrella to deal with the impacts of climate change, because while we sort of see the world changing, we need to kind of adapt to that quite quickly. And we also need to support those who can't afford a stronger umbrella, so those who are most vulnerable. So I guess I'll summarize the answer and be quite quick in terms of what we need to do is understand the actual risk profile and what we actually face. So what's our risk profile today and what will be in the future? What will the impact of climate change have? And infrastructure is often the solution we sort of turn to say, oh, build a bigger flood levee or a higher bridge, or houses that can be washed out and sort of restored to have life there more quickly afterwards. Heat resistant infrastructure. There's certainly methods, and that's certainly one part of it, but there's plenty more. And things around land use planning. I know as we see the debate in the sort of play out in the public at the moment around floods and whether we should be building on floodplains. these are long-term discussions, and they're almost sort of generational shift to go that we might be able to live there now, and in 5 and 10 years, we need to be planning for sort of 30 and 40 years and beyond the sort of the short-term election cycles to kind of go, what are we going to be doing in 30 and 40 years to get off these floodplains and live in safer areas? I think there's also that idea and a concept, I think, in relation to Robert's project around early warning systems. I think the UN published just recently some research around having 24 hours notice of early warning can actually cut costs by 30%. So it's a huge instant saving there and a way of adapting by just putting in systems to allow people to get out of their place, move their furniture, move their belongings up. And that's what has been happening in some parts of Western New South Wales, even today, as we sort of face floods there. But we've got good early warning systems in Australia. Building that community connectedness is really important. And I think that's really, we can combine some of the things together. So around having sort of really heat resistant infrastructure, for example, that might actually encourage community meeting points. So actually people understand their risks and they know what to do and they have that connection in community to actually work together to take action when there is a disaster and adapt to climate change. So I think it really revolves around that local approach. And I think we need to empower local government more in that space to do more with climate change adaptation. They're the ones that sort of front the community every day and are there on the ground. But it's not just government. It's more than just the government and the private sector. We need to have these agencies, both in government and the civil society, working together. These are big sort of challenges, and it's, I guess, the question I'll probably put to the group almost, or to everyone listening today, is how do we as sort of civil society and people appreciate what that risk is going to be and feel empowered and able to do something about it? We don't just rely on government or rely on the private sector to incentivise it. We take action early and we can consider what that means for us in terms of adapting to that climate change future risk.
Oh, thank you for that, Andrew. That actually feeds in well to my next question, which is for Vanessa. Vanessa, Vanuatu has traditionally relied on international aid during extreme weather events. And in fact, it's every country's reaction that when an event happens somewhere else, so we try and help. And Australia has received help in the past. But when COVID closed the borders and Vanuatu had to rely on its own support internally, can you tell us a bit about the experience of that and what lessons were learned?
Yeah, sure, Tim. So I guess first it's good to acknowledge that actually Vanuatu, I mean, we heard before, it's been ranked as the most disaster prone countries in the world. So it's good to acknowledge that that natural hazards are not new to Vanuatu. And so traditionally reliance has actually been within the Indigenous communities of Vanuatu. And it's really only in recent history that international aid has played a part. I mean, traditionally, Ni Vanuatu people have been recovering from cyclones and other disasters for thousands of years, especially volcanoes. We're on the Ring of Fire here, so there's a lot of experience with that. And there's a lot of local disaster planning and coping mechanisms that are present in Indigenous society. In fact, some islands don't even have a word for disaster because it's not seen, cyclones were not seen as disasters in some cases because they were just part of the natural system. They brought good things to communities in terms of regeneration, similar to, I guess, bushfires for Indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia. But it's the intensification of cyclone impact that means that local coping capacities might be at risk of not being able to see recovery through without more severe impacts to health and other types of impacts to human security. So there's a lot of strength in Ni Vanuatu communities already that should be drawn out of what we call the informal system. I don't really like that term myself, but it should be we should be building upon that to localize our disaster response mechanisms in Vanuatu. However, as you said, yes, there has been a recent history of international response in Vanuatu. So in 2015, when Cyclone Pam hit, it was quite a shock to Vanuatu. just because of the strength of the cyclone and the international humanitarian community and the international humanitarian structures that generally come in through UN OCHA, Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, came in, set up in country, and that was the first time that the Vanuatu government had seen such a big international surge capacity, and there were many, many different organisations that came in. That had benefits, but it also, in hindsight, created a little bit of backlash for the government, from the government of Vanuatu, because, you know, disaster response doesn't happen in a neutral political arena. It's you know, there's lots of other forces that are playing into it, and the strength that the international community showed in that time was seen as a bit of a threat to sovereignty, and you know, that it overwhelmed the local disaster response management structures in Vanuatu, and there were clashes between things like international standards of what relief should look like and what the Vanuatu government's idea of providing relief should be. There's a real strong narrative now in Vanuatu that aid shouldn't create dependency, that there's a very strong national narrative around resilience and reliance, self-reliance, which comes from a long history of Indigenous resilience. So that was PAM. And then in Harold, it was this very unique situation where the border had shut 3 weeks beforehand. There was a lot of fear over COVID at that time, and Harold struck as a nationally significant disaster, but the government chose not to bring in any surge capacity because the fear of COVID was more than the fear of not being able to respond to the disaster. So it was a good test of domestic disaster response systems. It was a very challenging time. I happened to work in the provincial government for both PAM and Harold, even though they struck in different parts of the country. So I had a good comparison, but yeah, there are a lot of challenges in Harold with things like things that the international community brings, like, for example, the Australian and New Zealand and French armies coming in with just significant ship capacity and significant volume of supplies. Instead, you know, we were relying more on localized distribution plans for relief. That was the supplies that we were able to get in country at that time. And some relief did come in on planes, but ships were definitely not permitted at that time. So the response was slower. People in more remote parts of the islands, especially in Santa, which is a large island with significant number of inland mountain communities, they were walking to get their relief distribution, such as food aid, which was in the form of, you know, tins, tinned beans, tinned meat, rice, and walking it back over a number of days back to their communities. So yeah, it was just very different disaster response landscape to PAM when the Australian Army came in with big helicopters and, you know, we're able to drop things everywhere. But that's not to say that one was better than the other. I mean, some of the communities that were serviced through Harold, you know, showed a lot of resilience in being able to rely on food that was sourced from damaged gardens for up to 3 to 4 weeks after the cyclone, while aid was waiting, and without any expectation that aid would come. So yeah, it's very interesting to think about how Vanuatu is going to progress and come up with a very localized and culturally appropriate disaster response plan across the islands.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. And it is interesting to think, you know, how that the Indigenous people of Vanuatu have lived with cyclones for centuries, and they have appropriate structures that they can rebuild quickly and so forth. And maybe it's the structures that have been imported are the ones that get damaged by cyclones and need that international response. We're running low on time, so I'm going to move on to Robert. Your research is focused on social media, and we heard a little bit about that, and its use during the extreme weather events. What should we be doing moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So just to a bit of background, like I mentioned previously, my research basically focuses on trying to explore information technology like social media to better support disaster risk reduction. And so I've worked on a project called Peta Jakarta. So this was mainly focused in Jakarta, Indonesia. So looking at Twitter as a way of mapping flood situation in real time to help the citizens and government of Jakarta to better manage flood situation. But more recently, I've led a project called #RecoverSouthCoast. So this project is basically looking at the role of social media in supporting recovery from the 2019-2020 bushfires within the South Coast region of New South Wales. That project, we interviewed a lot of victims of the bushfires. We interviewed councils, the councils that were involved, so Biggar Valley Council, Yorubadala, and also Shorehaven City Council. Now, what came out from this research is quite striking. So the first thing is that the way social media is used, we know that it's been used a lot in this disaster response, but recovery, social media is playing even an important role, equally important role in disaster recovery as well. So we find quite a wide scope of areas in which social media was used to support recovery for that particular event. So things like mental health and emotional support, post-disaster recovery and infrastructure services, even insurance claims, animal welfare, things about like information support, solidarity and social cohesion. So a lot of areas in which social media played very important role, including business and economic activities. So going from here, so to answer your question, like what should we be doing now? This research revealed as well that there's a lot of gaps in terms of capability within council. And if we need to progress, we need to look at there ways in which we can build capability within councils, within emergency agencies that we could fall back to. So in real time, we could tell, for example, the situations on ground. Our research has revealed a lot about how social media is being used in a way to manipulate conversations and narrative on discussions about recovery activities. Some of those discussions are being led by bot accounts and trolls accounts. But it's important that if we can develop, if we can, like agencies and councils could invest a bit in developing the required capability. So something, for example, like social media command center, we've seen this done in the United States of America, the American Red Cross. They've done this like a decade ago, and that works very well. So in real time, you can tell for any specific recovery activity that you're interested in, a recovery topic, you can tell in real time what is happening, who's leading the discussion, what are the people worried about, what are their needs, So, and I think this sort of information is important if we need to be able to take actions in good time to help support people who need help in disasters. A lot more. I think I'll leave it there because of time.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And I think yes, it is something we could talk about for quite a long time. And maybe we should open up a Twitter hashtag in relation to that. I'm going to move on to George because Robert talked a bit about the bushfire recovery. And during the Black Summer bushfires in Australia in 2019-2020, there was a lot of debate online about whether the worst fires in Australia's history were a result of hazardous conditions caused by climate change, severe drought, or poor mitigation. What can we do as an educational institution like UOW to educate climate change deniers about the reality of what we're living with?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tim. And I think it's important we try to do something about it, because I was just reading this morning about Emmanuel Macron's Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Policies, where they got 150 randomly selected people from around France and wanted to put them together to formulate what policies the French government should adopt to address climate change adaptation and mitigation. And as the first phase of that, they gave them a series of lectures on climate science. And of course, there were quite a number of, a small number of deniers and skeptics amongst those 150. And the experience was that most of those skeptics and deniers changed their views as a result. So there is evidence, I think, that education works, particularly when it's provided in a forum where people are going to be receptive to it. So a couple of years ago during Global Climate Change Week, Sam Marks from the School of Earth, Environmental, Atmospheric and Life Sciences gave a public lecture. And his public lecture was basically his third-year course on global environmental change condensed down to 1 hour. And it was fantastic. It was just so good. And I think if you could take something like that and maybe provide it with some, as an online learning modules, with then some scope for some face-to-face discussion, and you made that available to the public and UOW could do that, I think that would be a great thing that we could do to educate people about the real science of climate change. And a lot of deniers and skeptics, they're not bad people, right? They've just formed their own views based upon the information they've got available to them, their own models they've created in their own minds. When they do that, they've got some assumptions they've made that are perhaps wrong, some assumptions they've made even subconsciously, and through that process of learning, they'll find that a lot of those assumptions they made are actually wrong and their models aren't fit for purpose. And they'll become aware maybe of some of the assumptions they've made subconsciously as well that ended up leading them to, if you like, a poor conclusion.
Thanks, George. I think I agree with you that the role for education is really important. It gives me a chance to plug the carbon literacy program that we have announced. And when we get to the final questions, I'll put up a QR code so people who are students or staff of the university can actually enroll in this carbon literacy project and actually get that understanding of the climate science. I'd like to finish up the panel questions and then we'll look at what's happening in the Q&A by throwing something at Joshua. What does the future risk space look like? And how can initiatives like your Australian Young Professionals in Disasters help?
Yeah, look, again, just in the essence of time, Tim, I think, we've spoken about what that future risk is going to look like. And I think that's very clear. I think the picture in front of us, has almost been painted. And I think, right now it's very much about individuals, organizations, governments really putting their hats on and thinking about, what are the solutions moving forward? And I think, if you boil it down to its most, simple components, really when you look at the disaster space and what AYPD is looking at, it's really looking at, as disasters become, more complex, as they become, more frequent, the need to have individuals that understand these problems, that have the skills to solve these problems and actually operate in this industry, that also increases. So I guess for AYPD, there's probably two key strategies that we really are looking to drive. And I think the first one, and Andrew touched on it earlier, it's really about understanding that, disasters at the end of the day are really the nexus of all things. When you see a disaster impact a community, it disrupts everything from the natural environment to the economy to social issues. Everything becomes disrupted. So when you think about if the problem encompasses everything, well, then also the solution's got to encompass everything. And, what we think about in the disaster space is that, we really need individuals from right across the sector because everyone has a role to play when it comes to disasters and reducing systemic disaster risk. I mean, if you look at Andrew and I, we started as engineers from UOW, myself environmental, Andrew as a civil engineer, and it was only by sheer chance that we stumbled into the disaster space. So AYPD in that aspect is really looking at, how do we connect? How do we cross-pollinate? How do we actually bring not only more people specifically into the industry, but also how do we help other industries within, you know, communities and society actually understand what their responsibility is and that they actually have some levers to pull. I think just quickly as well, the second thing is very much around, as I said before, you know, just purely this numbers game. You know, I think really as these disasters become more complex, we've almost escalated on a scale in terms of the involvement of help that we've needed. You know, we've looked at, you know, we all know that often in incident management, the principle around, you know, we deal with it at the lowest local possible level when we're dealing with an incident. But as that escalates, as that capacity, as that coping capacity becomes overwhelmed, you need to go to that next level. And you've obviously seen how local governments step in to support communities, then states and territories. Federal government now through NEMA is looking at how do we support communities. But, you know, I know for us, AYPD, for people across the industry, you know, we potentially may get to a point where countries need to step in to help developed countries with disasters. You know, we think a lot about, and as Vanessa said, we think a lot about obviously, you know, developing countries and what we need to do. And there's some fascinating stories around how that's been done well and how it's not been done so well. But, you know, we potentially may get to a point where a disaster so big happens that a developing country like an Australia, like a New Zealand, you know, like an America may actually need support globally. So for AYPD, it's very much as well around not just obviously it's Australia, but what about the Asia Pacific neighbourhood? I think we've really got to start viewing disasters as a neighbourhood issue. And that neighbourhood really for us as Australia is across the Asia Pacific. So, you know, AYPD very much came out of a fact that, you know, for Andrew, myself and Mitchell Clout, our other founder, no one was doing anything. So for us, you know, we really wanted to be part of the change and drive something. And I guess that's where AYPD has come from.
Oh, it's such a fantastic initiative. Congratulations on setting it up. I'm now going to move to some of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. And we've got one, I'll probably maybe address this one to Vanessa and George. What are the 3 top priority areas for governments to fund to improve Australia's and, following on what Joshua just said, our neighbourhood, our Pacific neighbourhood infrastructure to mitigate the impacts of disasters such as floods, fires, cyclones, and sea level rising? So maybe Vanessa, what's on your wish list for collective governments to fund?
Well, it depends which government you're talking about, really, but I can speak with experience in Vanuatu here, and actually it reflects what a lot of the other panelists have been saying about where more strength is needed, and that's at the subnational level, because a lot of disaster response comes through voluntary networks. Everyone has to get involved, and, you know, I think there needs to be less of a dichotomy between government response and you know, civil society response. So I would say in Vanuatu specifically, there needs to be better decentralization of disaster response, strengthening. Love the idea of what Josh was saying about, you know, looking to the broader neighborhood. I mean, yeah, as Josh was saying, there's going to be disasters that are so great, and we've already seen it with the Australian bushfires. You know, they're so overwhelming in size that it becomes frightening with where you reach the limits of your capacity. And that's one thing that Australia and the Pacific Island countries need to think about, because there's going to be limits to our adaptive capacity. So, I mean, an area that I work in is displacement and climate-related mobility, and the Pacific countries are looking to start planning for that, because there are Pacific Island countries that are at very urgent risk of inundation by sea level rise within the next decade. So I think, yes, better and quicker ability to coordinate and learn from each other, I think is quite important. That was only 2, but I'll pass to George.
I think there was 2, maybe 2 and a bit. George, maybe you can give us two for Australia.
No, I don't know if I can give you 2, Tim, but I suppose I look at this in a slightly different way. I think, you know, to respond to disasters, you need to have the capacity to respond. And if a system is going to have capacity to respond, you can't be always driving that system at its limits. And I think we've just become accustomed in today's society to drive everything at its limits. We do everything as efficiently as possible. We trim off all the excess, there's no fat, and that leaves you with no capacity to respond. You've got to have a system that has spare capacity. And if you've got a system that has spare capacity, if everything is not being done at its limits, then you can respond. And that's, I think, a really big mind shift that's got to happen in our society. We've got to learn to leave spare capacity so that we can respond to these things. And to be honest, I don't know how we do that.
I might just jump in there, Tim, because I think that's a really good point that George makes. It's something that, again, Craig Pewgate, you know, many of you would have known Craig was brought in after New Orleans, and obviously FEMA had suffered a fair bit of reputational risk about, you know, going quite slow in terms of responding to that. And, you know, Craig Pewgate talks about that when he came in and asked people, you know, how can we make things go faster? How can we increase capacity? A lot of people, you know, on the other side of the desk to him said, well, you know, we've got to wait to hear what the problem is. We've got to wait to hear what the impact is. We've got to know what the data is. And, you know, Craig talks about how he, you know, eyeballed them from the other side of the table and said, how many cyclones, you know, how many disasters have we been through? How many hurricanes have we been through? We know what communities need. Let's start going early. Let's start going with what we think, and we can always dial it back. And I think that's, you know, what George is saying is really important. It's about saying not afraid, because at the end of the day, you know, if you went too little, too late, and you have fatalities, that's not acceptable from a community's point of view. If you go harder and you go earlier and you have some excess, then I think, as George says, we have to be comfortable with that and say, you know, that is just the cost of where we are at the moment. The decisions that we have made in the past, where we as communities decided to live, that is the cost of having that. That is the cost of what, you know, we need to accept as communities. So I think it's an interesting point from George.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And we're just about out of time. So I promised I'd do a plug for the Carbon Literacy Program. So the QR code there will get you in, but you have to be a University of Wollongong member of staff or student. And you can self-enroll in this course and learn about climate change, climate science, and make yourself an educated person who can converse and convince the climate deniers that we actually do have climate change. So I hope you got a chance to shoot that on your phone. I'll stop sharing, and I want to give a big thank you to our panelists today. You know, they've come from wide and far, and they've given us their expertise. And it's fantastic to know that we've got such great people who are thinking about these things. And I think that idea that we need develop local capacity, capacity that can help our neighbors, and that we need a reserve. We can't be running on empty all the time. We actually need to have something that we can call on in disasters. So thank you very much, George, Robert, Andrew, Josh, and Vanessa for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for your insights, and this I think has been a special event. Thank you very much to the large number of participants who joined us, and thank you to the questioners. Sorry we couldn't get through more questions today. And we hope you'll join us for more Global Climate Change Week events. And Marion, if you can put the link into the chat there, or perhaps we can show it on the screen. But we've got a whole heap of events that take us right up to the 18th of October. In particular, on Saturday night, we have the Op Shop Ball. So if you haven't got your ticket and you don't have your 1970s retro gear got from Green Connect or Vinnie's, get them now and come down to the Innovation Campus at 6 p.m. on Saturday and join in the revelry and the retro fashion show that we're going to have. So thank you all. Stay safe, stay dry in the next wet that we have, and keep doing the fantastic work you're doing. My name is Tim McCarthy, and it's been lovely to share this event with you today.